Hi, my name is Benedict for Higher Hertz. Welcome to a new arc. We're actually trialing the concept of putting reviews into what I'm mostly referring to as a story arc. I've already been doing a little bit of it, which is to put reviews of devices together so that we can become a little bit more comparative. You may have noticed that with the last three videos on the compressors, that they were all together and actually using the same material. So it gives you a much easier sense of not only learning the differences between these compressors, but also being able to hear and get a sense of, well, what am I looking for? So part of the thing behind what we do here is to give people training as well. As far as I'm concerned, there are far too many reviews which are really just a veiled excuse for buy this. I abhor that kind of approach. I'm always trying to add value and help you to choose what's going to be good value for you. I'd rather see you have one or two compressors in your arsenal that you really get value out of than 78 that gave a kickback for no positive gain. We're looking at saturation this time, which is a subject that's near and dear to my heart. It is in certain ways not an easy one, and unfortunately it's one that's become rather skewed, so we will need to clarify some things as well. A little bit of housekeeping. It is hotter than hell in here, so I do have the fan going. If you hear there's a little bit more background noise, it's because it's hotter than hell. Ooh, sorry, wrong band. Moving forward, saturation. So let's get our head around what saturation really is. We'll start with an AB. I'm going to work on the assumption that you are listening using decent studio monitors, or whatever your studio setting is. They don't have to be studio monitors. They can be good quality hi-fi speakers. I am not judgy on this stuff. Or worst comes to the worst, headphones. But please, mixing and headphones really don't go together as well as many would like you to think. This is a full mix without saturation, and then we're going to hear the same full mix with saturation at every point of the mix. Drive. Now, hopefully you hear there that there's some sort of slightly indefinable oof that comes in with the saturated mix. I've tried as much as is possible all the way through this to keep levels as even-steven as possible, because I don't want, oh, that one's louder, therefore sounds better, to be a decision factor here. It is a problem that we have to be aware of with particularly saturation, and a nasty trick that has been used against many people. So what we should notice with good saturation is not that the mix necessarily even sounds much different. It definitely should not sound distorted, but you should hopefully have this feeling of, oh, it's a bit richer, it's a bit sparklier, it's a bit more deep. People refer to that as 3D. It's got this sort of extra feeling of depth and of, well, I won't say real, because nothing about recorded music is or ever was real, but a feeling that it's more engaging. So we might say that this feels a little flat, and that this feels more engaging. That's saturation in action. Now let's look back and understand what saturation is. Saturation, commonly people will say, oh, your mix is too clean, man, it needs to be dirty. Okay. What does that mean? And then they'll just come in with pointless answers about, oh, but add saturation, man. And then when you go and listen to their apparently great mixes that are not clean, all you hear is lots and lots of distortion. And that's okay, it's a valid enough mix, I guess, says the man wearing a Metallica t-shirt. But a Metallica mix, Justice or Black, doesn't actually sound distorted. Yes, there's lots of really distorted guitars, but the mix itself doesn't sound distorted. It sounds actually beautiful and clear. I mean, Justice is tremendously clear, as is Black. So distortion and saturation are really not the same thing, even though they are very related and technically sort of the same thing, but you need to separate them out. I actually separated out a couple of units that were describing themselves as saturation, and I've moved them off to possible future reviews for character distortions because they ain't saturators. Or at least if they are, their volume knob starts at 11 and goes to 49, which is, well, a lot further than Spinal Tap were prepared to go. So saturation is, let's think in terms of a sponge. When a sponge is dry, it's dry. It's just it, you know. Dry sponges aren't that exciting. Once it has become wet, it's a wet sponge. Then, once it's become so wet, she cannot take no more, Captain, to borrow from Star Trek, that is the term saturated. Like you pick it up and water drips out of it. It's past wet, it's saturated, it is full or over full. So what saturation actually does is it adds more fullness to our sound. It's how it does it from one type of saturation to another where it gets incredibly interesting. That sense of full is what we hear in the AB with the whole mix. Now let's look at, here's a sound. This is not exactly a full sound, is it? This is a pure sine wave, and we're going to use this because it gives us a very, very visible way of seeing what's happening. So we have our synth. At the moment it's clean. If we put that through a tube, which is this, oh look, suddenly we've got another appearing. And listen to that sound. That's changing. So from here, sort of pure and clear and a bit Once we move to here, it suddenly has a lot more presence. It leaps forward because we've given it overtones. So in a sense, right now, I'm performing a form of additive synthesis. I've taken my initial waveform, which we'll call our fundamental, and we've added overtones. And we can keep doing that right up to essentially a pulse or a sawtooth or something. I'm not going to get too fussy about what that is. And depending upon the balance of those harmonics, which is called bias, so that's probably more a square wave, pulse wave, and that's getting into a sawtooth. And that's still, at heart, this innocent little sine wave. That is the essence of distortion and how distortion works. But saturation is subtle. So we, wherever that was before, should have essentially the same sound. Now here, once I start playing chords, pure and clean, a little bit more pedal, it's actually distorted. What we've got there is 3 sine waves, and they've now all got their extra overtones. And because of how they're interacting with each other, we get what's called intermodulation distortion. That is not anti-aliasing or aliasing. It's not bounce back. There may be a tiny bit there, but it's not what we're hearing. What we're hearing there is intermodulation distortion. And intermodulation distortion was Jon Lord of Deep Purple's very best friend. He used a lot of distortion and used it to bring his B3 and invented the rock organ and to push that forward so that it was as oomphy as any rock guitar. So he was able to contend with Ritchie Blackmore in the band. And that's how that works. That's distortion. But obviously, at this point, it's really clearly distortion because our signal is not the same. So while it's tempting to get distortion units and call them saturation, it's not the same thing. And it's equally not the same thing, assuming we had a wet dry knob here, to say, oh, well, I'll put that much drive on it and then change my wet dry balance. That's still just a distorted sound that you're choosing to parallel for some reason. It's not a path I encourage anyone down. Go there if it makes sense to you, but if you're going there going, oh, it puts me ahead of the curve, no, you put yourself behind the curve because you haven't really understand what you're doing. Get a more subtle unit if you don't want that much drive on the front end. So, we can then look at an actual saturation unit. This is the saturation knob from Softube. This is the rack extension version of it. This is a freebie at the cost of going and signing up over at Softube and downloading their knob. It's a pretty unassuming plugin, and that's why I'm starting here, because there's not a lot we can go and discuss with regards to features and function, because it has no features, but it has a great function. So what this is doing is exactly what we just saw. It's adding overtones, but you see where this tube adds them sort of pretty evenly and pretty, what we'll say, linearly. The saturation knob starts that way and then suddenly leaps into all manner of interesting, with see these overtones appearing all of their own accord. It's got a little knob here to tell you, yeah, your total harmonic distortion is probably getting ugly, in case you are too silly to notice this is ugly. So a little bit gives us saturation, as in we are making our signal more full of signal. Apart from the fact that this does add level, it doesn't take away. Notice how the sound starts to develop more body or character. It's fuller all round. Different types of saturators will focus what they create in different places. So if we bring up an image, here's one I prepared earlier. This is a non-pedantic overview of saturation. So please don't Captain Obvious in and tell me that something is technically wrong with it, because technically I don't care. Practically I don't care. This is about just the broad idea. So we have our fundamental, which is this fella that I'm playing you here. We have overtones, so this is probably something like a sawtooth. It's got lots of nice even overtones on every harmonic. Saturation creates extra overtones, some of which will neatly line up with the overtones of that sound. Particularly the first few overtones that are created will tend to sit on one of these relatively close harmonics. If you've already got harmonics there, it just makes that harmonic brighter. So if we had this and our overtone was appearing here, this harmonic would just get a little bit brighter. Now what that's going to do is take our sound, make it seem to be the same, but just a little bit brighter, a little bit fuller. When most of the created overtones are down here and matching an existing harmonic of the sound, you will just get a fuller, brighter sound, but without much or any of the intermodulation distortion. If you get a situation like this, where one of the harmonics is either not in the sound or not perfectly in the series, then you start to get that interesting, clangorous, dissonant kind of distortion. Now, a tiny bit of that is actually surprisingly nice. It adds this kind of beefy, muscular body to your sound. If it's down here, if it's up here, it starts to add initially a kind of a sparkle and then a clangorous, jangly, belly sort of nasty sound. Well, there seems to be somebody working on our roof. You will also see, once you start to get enough drive, that you get some undertones appear. They're a whole other ball game, and they are also part of your intermodulation distortion, not necessarily a result of aliasing or Nyquist bounce back. Nyquist Batsback will tend to be in other places. Again, this is not technically correct, it just wants to show you what happens. So something like an Aphex aural exciter would put a lot of foofy up here, and that will brighten your signal. We could hear that when we AB. If we AB here, the hi-hats and what have you start to get that little bit brighter, but everything starts to get a little bit oomphier too, and there also might be a scoop in the mids. I'm not quite sure what's going on there, and to be perfectly blunt, I forgot what I used to do it. I think it's the saturation knob, but it's possible it wasn't. It was just an AB of A saturation unit. So these extra overtones that appear are like the water in our sponge. They are making our sponge full, even overfull. Too much overfull is just distortion. A nice amount of invisible overfull will just give this feeling of the sound being richer. So how do we get saturation? Now, people will tell you that, oh, you get classic gear because, and you know what, it actually did, but you've got to take most of what's told to you by the seller of VSTs and people who are peddling the sellers of VSTs, or trying to tell you what you want to hear in faux tutorials about how little they know about how mix engineering really, really works. I know, they can hate me, you can hate me as much as you like, but as I've already pointed out several times, good quality studio equipment was surprisingly quiet, clean, and clear. If you don't believe me, go look at people like Dan Worrell on Paul Third. Actually shows on his screen comparisons of modern plugins that are claiming to be as good as the analog original, and they've got more noise and more distortion in them than the analog originals. The original gear was surprisingly clean, surprisingly clear. Initially, it was designed to be as clean, as clear as possible, and any kind of distortion that was there was like, oh, I am so sorry, we couldn't do any better. If you're buying cheap equipment, yeah, it was nasty. But it just distorted, and, well, you learned to live with the horrible muddy results that were there, and that was just what it was. That was why you went to a fancy studio, Sam, Abbey, Bahamas, the one out there. The thing is, when you got to a certain level, studio equipment was incredibly clean. Some things were designed that where they were going to start to make noise, because noise was inevitable, or adding overtones, adding electronic distortions were inevitable, and they worked out how to balance them. And that is exactly what I'm showing you, that when you've got this little bit of overtone that's being added, it sounds pleasing and musical. So they simply said, okay, where are we going to choose how these overtones appear? So if we flip back to our tube here, they're pleasing enough. That's sort of pleasing, that's not so much. Fine if we are Jon Lord, but bearing in mind this is supposed to be studio equipment, not band equipment, then that's a bit eh. So choosing to put things on the odd harmonics, you can hear how that cleans that from nasty to what we call chimey. It's adding something, but it's adding it in what we might consider a clean or pleasing sort of a way. If we're trying to be Jon Lord, yes, we're going to pile them on in, lots of over and undertones. But if we're having to live with inevitable distortions from things, we can choose where those overtones are going to get put, and more often than not they will be pleasing. And this doesn't go dry enough, but if we flip back to the saturation knob, we notice that within the tolerances of good manners, this thing is effectively no drive whatsoever until it breaks that tolerance. And that's what older gear was like. Your Neve console or whatever, plug something in, it sounds the same at the faders as it does here. As much as any of that really is true, there wasn't a massive change in sound, but it becomes cumulative. So this AB between the mixes, play it for you again. At every point there, so at every instrument, I've got, as I say, I think it's one of these doing very minor works, probably set to about 1 or less, but quite minor. At a bus, so the rhythm bus will have one of those as well, same sort of thing, and the masters will have one of those too. And what happens is that cumulatively, each instrument is embiggened, saturated. And where they come together, the same happens, and you get this nice, warm, rich sound. Warm, bright, depending upon the colour of your saturation, whether you have more of your extra, come back, whether you have more of your added harmonics down here, or God forbid down here, but whether you have more of them here or more of them up here. And also how much they correspond to comfortable overtones based on the original signal versus uncomfortable overtones based on the original signal. And obviously the complexity of the original signal will define how they sound, but so long as they are low, low, low in the mix, as they are here, we don't know they're there, we just feel like this sound is, it's nicer. You know, a fully dry sponge is actually not a nice thing. It's like this hard sort of kind of thing. A sponge with water dripping out of it, I don't know. But a sponge that's just damp enough, without being, well, damp and dank, is a nicer thing. So it's that little balance between and where we actually find that we can make our sounds work beautifully. And that's the whole plan with this approach to things. So it doesn't matter what sound you feed it, trying to ignore the level difference here, we will get a little bit more brightness. Doesn't matter what we do, we're going to get more brightness. So if we turn this into a saw, we're adding level, which makes it harder. The tube is not going to be kind. If we filter this a little, roll it off some, make it a little bit easier to live with. While that sounds nice and fully honest, because that's literally the sound that's coming out of the synth, it's also prone to feeling a little flat and papery. So this is the next part of what we learn about saturation, that it's not a simple sort of set and it always stays the same. So when we show those pictures of the sine wave and some overtones, we kind of get the impression that, oh, well, that's what it is. But no, this sound is moving. You can hear on the beginning a little what as the filter opens. You see it here. That's moving, which means that the harmonics that are generated move as well. And the more complex that becomes, because we're complexifying with extra overtones, the more that sound feels like it actually moves in what we will again refer to as 3 dimensions. So it feels more complex and it's harder for us to go, oh, it's just that. It's that. Cool. That sounds nasty. Again, on the surface, easier to go, well, that's not making a big difference, and then go, oh, well, I better turn it up to there. Oh, yeah, no, it's saturated, man. But once you try to mix that down, you are just, well, not going to work. That's a lot of saturation. Starting to get a little, but it's within the realms of okay. But we keep putting those little tiny bits in. Remember, as soon as we can hear a saturator in terms of kind of like this, it's no longer a saturator, you're just distorting things. Your business, and that's okay. There are great gains to be made in a nice bit of distortion. Better when I've selected it. Oh, not that much. But that's quite a different proposition from that. So saturation, your signal should sound exactly the same in many ways, but with the tiny bit of it, and as it accumulates through the whole mix, in the end your mix should feel quite a lot richer. It is going to take you a bit of time to feel it, because the first few times you try to do it, you are probably going to do this. Oh, that sounds great. And in a sense, it sort of does. You know, don't get me wrong, I'm not anti-distortion. But that's distorted. We've now changed our sound. Think in terms of make the sound you want. Let's say I made this as the sound that I wanted and said, okay, that's what I want. I may not need to use saturation on it, but then again, I just might. I might say, okay, I'm going to put a little bit of saturation on this. Because if we were to think practically, if I had my synthesizer, let's call it a Jupiter 8. And I've plugged my Jupiter 8 into my combo, because, well, that's what you did. And I've mic'd that, and I've brought that up to my desk. I plug it into the back of my Neve, and at that point, we get a little bit of saturation. Now, I don't have this wired to do that, but it's just that tiny bit of change that happens, so we've complexified our sound slightly. Maybe we don't need it. Back then with a Neve, we had no real choice, which meant that often what would happen is when your artist came to you and they would have this full-on sound, you'd go there and you'd be like, let's just back that up a little bit here, buddy. And he'd be like, oh, you're ruining my sound, man. Because we know that when we put that through something that's going to add a little bit more overtone, this is going to turn into this. And then the artist is going to complain. It's like, oh, it sounds thin and papery and hard and like, yucky, man, I had a great sound and you ruined it. And it's like, well, yeah, buddy, but this is why we pulled your sound back a little bit, because we know that we're going to plug it into our Neve, which is going to add just, you know, this tiny little bit of overtone somewhere, and you're probably going to want me to put some reverb on it, and so that's going to add a little bit of overtone, and it's going to get bussed, which means that it's going through another input, and it's going to the masters, and then you're going to want it mastered because you don't want the mix to come back to you like 12 dB down. All of those things are going to add a little bit, so by the time you want this sound, this is probably what you'll get with this. So while that seems rather long-winded, it's about understanding how things work. Most people with a DAW have never worked in the real world, and many who have forgotten how things really work. So create your sound, then add a tiny invisible bit of saturation, if you're going to just automatically put across everything, or just add it where you feel you need it, and that's how you will get the final feeling of like, oh, I've got this great big 3D Pro sounding mixer, because that's how it works. Again, A/B, nothing on anything. Saturation on everything with mild settings. So cumulatively, we've created this great sense of activity. Collectively, those things will build up. So if we've got our overtones that we can see here, if and when they go through another round of saturation, you'll find that they get a little bit of overtone here. They'll also get a little bit of double up here and what have you, but it'll get more complex. And if you've got a sound that's, let's say, here, then they're going to interact with each other. That's the beginnings of intermodulation distortion. So if you've got too much, your mix will start to distort with itself, even though there is no apparent distortion there. Solo, everything sound fine, will be like, yeah. But then once you put them together, they start to interact with each other in unpleasant ways. So go easy. We've got the saturation knob, which we've looked at. Saturation knob is a beautiful thing, and if you get one saturator that you don't want to have to think about, do I use this one or that one, and you just go, look, I'm going to do it easy and not worry about whether I'm getting this right, then easy and probably quite a wise choice. Right, so where were we at? We were at, if we were going to use saturation knob as our one saturation unit and not really need to worry about it, then not a drama. I would suggest you can do it one of two ways. You can put your saturation knob at the end of every chain. So if I have my synthesizer or my instrument, I can put my saturation knob here. Therefore, whatever is happening to the synth goes to the saturation knob and then through any effects that follow. So in other words, we put it first in our effect chain, or you can put it last in your effect chain. So you can have your instrument, your delay, your chorus, what have you, reverbs, not that I like to put reverbs on tracks, and then you can put your saturator at the end, dump it on the end of every single one. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. What that does then is it does its magic to the whole signal. So that's the equivalent of having a Jupiter 8, plugging it into your delay, which you plug into your chorus, which you plug into your amp, which you plug into your microphone, which you plug into your neve, which is your saturation. That's what you're doing. The other way is that you've got your instrument, your saturator. So that way you've taken your Jupiter 8, you've DI'd it into your neve, saturation, and then you've added a chorus, a reverb, a whatever. Either is okay. I would suggest that you pick one path and use it consistently through your mix. Mixing and matching may seem real clever, but one of the problems with mixing and matching can be that in the end, if you're not very aware of what's happening, is that you've got things that don't match and they'll stand out, and you might think, oh wow, that really stands out in the mix, and it's just like you've put it in another room, buddy. So it's like going to see Metallica, and it turns out that Lars is still in San Francisco and he's dialing his drum performance in. It's probably not what you're hoping for. Matter of fact, to be honest, when I saw Metallica, I felt like they dialed their performance in too, but at least they were all in the same room some of the time. So, if you're going to do that, then set. I think a very safe value is 0.7. So if you set everything to just 0.7 and forget it. Just drag and drop it, duplicate it into everything. Duplicate it into your bus using the same before or after process, and duplicate it into your masters here using the same before or after process. I tend to put my saturation after my first compressor, because that way it controls any of the spiky wikies that are going into there, allows the saturation to be more even, but it's entirely up to you so long as you've thought about what you're doing and you're not reinventing the wheel at every turn of that wheel. Because obviously if you're reinventing the wheel every time it goes round, you don't really have a wheel, you just have, well, a train wreck. So, saturation knob. Beautiful device. You can choose to filter out what parts you hear. I find it makes no difference. Read the manual, give it a try. Couldn't care less. It probably matters more when you are using heavy-handed settings, which I prefer not to do. Let's have a listen. We have our electric piano line. Beautifully played by the jazz master Benedict. It's just random. This will be subtle. Now if we go to the saturation knob, tube amp. So Voxen Go tube amp, and this is the order in which we will look at these. This is a little more aggressive than the saturation knob, but definitely has its charms. Clean, little flat. We're hearing a little bit of intermodulation, but that would sound lovely on a record. The sat knob is polite. If we go up a little bit, we are hearing just this nice little sheen of beauty. And that's what's great about the saturation knob, is that in many ways it's completely transparent. You use it like this, it just does its job superbly. No messing about. Tube amp, IVGI, which is the Klanghelm. Supposedly emulates a desk, I'm not sure which one, but has a sound. So from clean, got this nice sort of presence. It is giving us a little bit more in the mids, but that's nice. Too many mixes lack mids, which means they lack presence. And then this Hornet analog stage. Like the saturation knob, it's kind of transparent. We will go through that as we go, but I think there are some things about it that makes a rather nice thing. Now, again, I will suggest that you do not mix your flavors. While it can be tempting to say, oh, well, this sounds better with this and this sounds better with that, you've got mixed saturation all over the place. The reason that these sound different is that they are putting their overtones in different places. So if we go back to Pikachu, remember some of where some saturators put things is nice and neatly on overtones that are tidy. They're going to sound smooth and sleek and all of that. Some will put them off, which means that if you use the same unit, you'll get the same results. Therefore, if they are choosing to use some off overtones, then you'll have one off overtone through the whole piece. Like if you have a Neve, so long as it's been surfaced somewhere in the last millennium, then its overtones are going to be consistent. Whereas if you track one thing on a Neve track, then the next thing on an SSL track, and then the third thing on a Spirit desk, and then the fourth one on a Tandy desk or a Radio Shack desk, you're probably going to have your overtones in different places on every single one. And while you can go, oh, but that's so creative, man, I'm like, optimizing, man, the problem is that, especially when you come to add your layer of saturation towards buses and masters, is that it's going to be picking up these ones in particular, or it's going to be picking up what's different and amplifying them. Therefore, you start to munge your mix with the negative sides of distortion. You start to intermodulate. And intermodulation on a single instrument, particularly John Lord's B3, can be super. We're hearing a little bit of intermodulation on the tube amp here. And that gives us that beautiful sort of Boss Skaggs kind of feel. That's great. But we are starting to flirt with distortion almost more than saturation there. But we can accept that as saturation. But if we now put that into a different kind of a saturation unit, let's say this fella, we might get something better, but we might well get something worse. And we're probably not going to be consciously hearing it. Therefore, we'll be like struggling to get our mix to feel like it's cohesive because we've just thrown mud in the middle of it. There's good saturation, like a sponge with nice clean water. That's a nice feeling sponge. But a sponge with mud is not a nice feeling sponge at all. So My advice very strongly in the saturation across my whole mix thing is pick one. You can pick different ones for different tracks if you like, but if you're wanting the feeling of here's my record that's a record of the time, as Jackson Browne said, and is a pretty darn important thing to have in mind, then you probably would have recorded that in one studio, mixed that in one studio. In which case you might consider saying, okay, for this record, I feel like I want to be a bit Boz Scaggs, let's say. Who doesn't love the buzz? And if you don't go out there and research the man, in which case we might say, I'm going to make Voxengo's Tube Amp my saturator for this. Set up some nice mild settings, populate it across your whole thing. That will give you a consistent feel across your whole track and potentially across your whole album, rather than just going, I'll have a bit of this here, a bit of that there, and then wondering why you struggle to have this sense of consistency. So at least per song, pick one. Preferably per album, pick one and use it consistently across. If you decide you want to go a little harder on a track for some reason, you know, the soppy love song that Bob Ezrin's making you write, you might say, look, okay, we've got this tube amp and we'll just go a little harder. And assuming that's not making a mess of what Bob's actually really going to do for you, #1 hit, boys, then that could be wise. But if you just go, well, I need to prove how clever I am because somebody else is telling me what to do, and I'm just going to use this and turn it to 47, that's not mixing, that's just basically being a spank. And if that's the case, go have a look at the What Almost Happened story with Quiet Riot's cover and #1 everywhere. Come On Feel the Noise. They tried to sabotage it despite the fact that they'd signed with this producer on the proviso that they do the track that he wanted them to do, and they tried to sabotage it, but thankfully they were so disorganized amongst themselves that their sabotage didn't work. If anything, actually worked in their favor, and the producer was right, and they had a stonking hit which opened the charts to metal. So Quiet Riot, Twisted Sister, Bon Jovi, Motley Crue, Cinderella, all these guys owe it to that producer, and the fact that those guys were too stupid to muck up what they were trying to do in the first place. So follow where you're going, be consistent. I know that doesn't seem related to saturation, but there's always a relationship in the studio. Pick your particular device and populate that across your whole session, not mix and match, and that way you will find that you get nice results. Again, you're not listening for noticeable differences. Tube amp does come across as warmer than the saturation knob. Saturation knob is quite bright. It might pull some mids, but I'm not going to argue on that. The IVGI is actually adding mids. It's a nice warm centralized sound. Unlike the saturation knob, the Hornet seems, even at its more extreme setting, quite mild, but it's very pleasing. Though, if you have questions, they're either going to get some answers in the next videos, which will be about Voxengo's Tube Amp, Klanghelden's IVGI, and then Hornet's Analog Stage 2. Otherwise, hit the subscribe button and ask them below. Please don't ask what's going to be the best, because that's for you to work out what's the best. I would, and have, put any of these on my mixes. If I didn't think that they were good and capable of being pretty bulletproof, then I wouldn't be putting them in here. So no need to ask me what I think's the best, because these are, as far as I'm concerned, the best, without getting into over-the-top things. And to be really blunt, most of the over-top things that I've tried, you know, $200, $300, $400 VST, I've thought, really? Now, maybe they are better if you've got some full-on amazing studio man, but I think the reality is, where most of us are at, no one's going to know the difference. No one's going to care. To borrow again from Gene Simmons, the kids don't care about your guitar tone. They only care if this song rocks them. So no one cares what devices you're using. No one cares what you paid for it. They do care if you paid for it. If you don't support the things you use, expect to struggle. Just as you want your fans to support you, you've got to support them. You've got to support the backline, the people who are providing you with information, which is why we ask for you to subscribe and engage and share us around. So these are more than good enough for any task. Again, if you've got a question, ask on down below. Hit that subscribe button. You can also pop over to higherhertz.com for a different strand of information. Try it out. Take your time. Most importantly, you have fun.